very, very long time ago, back before most of you, I think, were born, in the mid-1990s, when bands used to play slow, sad songs, everyone used to hold up their lighters in the air. But those days are gone. This is the year 2004. It's the age of the internet, technology.
All right, what's going on, everyone? Happy New Year's. It is officially 2024, and today's topic is going to be about something that happened 20 years ago, which is pretty crazy to think about because I remember this time period pretty well. But I got a request to talk about Tom DeLonge's live rig from 2004, really his live tone. But there's going to be a couple videos here, and I'm going to do a sound samples one. But the thing is, it's hard for me in a recording setting to replicate live tones. Live sound is such a different world. The physics of sound come into play, the venues, if you're on in-ears and all kind of different things. So I really just want to break down his rig from what we know and not just say what gear he used. There's really awesome channels that talk about this stuff, Gear 182 being one of them, and there's a lot of cool guests they have on there that know a lot of stuff. But for me, I wanted to just talk about the gear and explain what each piece of gear actually does as far as what I actually know, and make my kind of theory behind what was going on here, because it's not as simple as, well, get all this stuff, plug it in, and you're going to sound like that. The other issue is most of what we have from 2004 as far as recordings and live shows go is very wonky quality. Things like Jimmy Kimmel Live and TRL, they have a weird TV mix, and on top of that, most of it's just VHS rips from back in the day, so that just gets all messed up. There are things like the Camden show from New Jersey that went up a few years back. It's pretty good, pro done, but again, the sound's gonna vary from the house mix and things like that. And they didn't really do a lot of live album stuff after that one from 2000. So I want to talk more about the theory behind how this stuff can be used, what it does, and go through just some of the pictures and info we have. Again, I will do an accompanying video and try to demonstrate some of this stuff, but it's not going to be identical or even match super well, because there isn't really something to match it to per se. You can say, okay, the live tone from this video, regardless of the quality of it, it's going to differ from different live shows because of the recordings and just they didn't really archive it the way some bands do, like how Metallica does or somebody like that, where they have all these different shows recorded. At least if they do, they haven't really told us. Mostly it's bootlegs and things like that. Okay, I'm not going to talk about guitars too much, but it needs to be said that Tom switching guitars did have to play a role in him switching up his amp setup. So the 2002 Boxcar Racer era, we know he switched from his signature Strat to the ES335. He had a couple of those red ones. Most people call it the Boxcar Racer guitar, or the Boxcar Racer, ES335, whatever, compared to the Boxcar Strats. And I believe he sold one of them, the backup, but he kept that red one. He used it in the edging video. He used it in Angels and Airwaves. It's the one with all the stickers on it. And that's pretty much an off-the-wall Gibson ES335 semi-hollow that they basically just put a Seymour Duncan Invader in the bridge, and he used it how he would use his Les Pauls or his Strats. Now, when it came to the signature, I believe Tom got a couple of them right off the bat, and then eventually I believe he had 5 of the brown with the cream racing stripe. He said in multiple interviews there's 2 main reasons he switched to this guitar. Number one, he was having the problems with the disc in his back. He was on all the painkillers, things like that. Being a 6'4" guy and playing a Strat, which can get kind of heavy, it's not the heaviest guitar, but playing it as low as he did every single night on tour for years, I'm sure that had a big effect on him. So semi-hollows, while they're not thin like an SG and have that neck dive, they are semi-hollow and in effect can be much lighter, especially with the higher quality Gibsons, some of the woods that they use. The other thing that he went on record saying is that the Strat kind of felt very small to him because he was so tall, like a violin, I think he said. So these guitars are much bigger. If you see any videos where I'm playing a Strat versus where I'm playing my semi-hollow, my arm is definitely, positioned differently, things like that. I'm not a small dude, I'm about 6 foot, but they're still, they're pretty big guitars. So again, I'm not going to go too far into all the specs with the 333, but effectively it's his version of a 335. They didn't finish the neck, used some different woods, had his kind of design with a stripe, single volume knob, single pickup, which is important because they switched the pickup obviously to a Gibson Dirty Fingers, and then the plastic like kind of cover over the neck tenon, so where that joins the body, that's covered, but there's no pickup there. I think the guitar itself has to be much more resonant. I know my Epiphone version is, because it's a semi-hollow, not just different woods, but just the fact that it has the hollow body kind of thing to it. It resonates more, has kind of a bassy low end response. When you play it, you can kind of feel that. And the Dirty Fingers pickup, I think, is a good complement to that versus like an Invader. Invader has a lot of low end to it, whereas the Dirty Fingers, I think, is a bit more in the high mid-range cut. It doesn't have a bad low end. It sounds very full compared to like a 498T or a 500T, which sounds really thin to my ear. And the ones that I've owned sounded thin, felt thin when I was playing them. The Dirty Fingers, to me, I had it in a Les Paul first. I've really liked how that sounded, and it sounds good in the semi-hollow, but it's not as low-endy. It's got kind of more of a mid-high thing. Probably comparable output. I haven't looked at the numbers. You can find that online, but Tom being Tom for years and years and years, it was just hot pickup, hot bridge pickup. I don't think he was much of a like nerd like a lot of us are who got into guitars because of him having all this cool gear. I think it was like, hey, you know, he said, I like Strats, they're punk rock. He said that he liked them more than the Les Pauls because they looked better with stickers all over them. And, you know, obviously Strats, most of them come with single coils, not going to really do for that kind of sound he was going for. Voila. Before I switch to the amp section though, what's interesting about the guitars is if you look at pictures from 2003, so they were recording the Untitled record, and they go out and do some shows. So they did like the military stuff overseas, which is in the documentary, and they've documented that pretty well. They've done like the Summer Sonic, I think it was a Japanese festival, and there was some other stuff. They ended up doing the Dollar Bill tour to promote the album. I want to say that started at the end of 03. Could be wrong, don't quote me on that. But Tom has a couple of these brown signature Gibson ES333s with the cream racing stripe. He did get the orange racing stripe version with a matching headstock as like a prototype, and I think somebody might own that now. If there's only one, if there's two, I know one was hanging in the Vegas Hard Rock. One of my buddies sent me a picture not that long ago, and you can find it online. But that one never saw the stage, I don't believe. So back to the 2003 thing, what's interesting is if you look at pictures where you can see his guitar rack, he's playing one of the brown ones, and there's one on the rack. The red boxcar guitars out there, and then he has two Fenders baritones, his orange Adam Song Strat, which was like the main Adam Song guitar once he got it, and then the one that he used before that, which was the yellow subsonic, kind of like a prototype version that's in a lot of the, you know, promo pictures of him holding it. He did have a red Telly baritone before that, I believe, but there's not a lot of pictures of it. It's hard to find. And why I find this interesting is by 04, there's no more red boxcar guitar, and he said he had 5 of those brown with the cream racing stripes. I think one was a like a warm-up guitar he kept in his like backstage in the green room, and then obviously he would have like E standard, capo on 2 for things like that had to be in that kind of F sharp or like a B key, so things like Going Away to College, or he used it like for Violence. And then there's the Feeling This, he has drop D with the capo on 2, so it's like drop E, and then a backup. But also what's interesting is still Fender baritones. So Gibson doesn't really make a lot of baritones. It's kind of not really their thing. It's interesting because he has the white Jazzmaster, which is a baritone. So live, C sharp standard, a whole step and a half down, they're playing Obvious. And then while that was recorded in that tuning, Adam's song was recorded a full step down in D standard, but they played it in C sharp standard live. So he's using that guitar for Adam's song and for Obvious. Mostly Obvious was like, I mean, they played both on those tours, but Obvious was like the newer song. And then the orange guitar becomes the backup. What's really weird about that to me is he clearly was ordering these Gibsons before he had that white Jazzmaster on stage, at least. And it looks like that has a Dirty Fingers in it that's unmarked. So Dirty Fingers didn't used to have that gold foil, like that logo on it, until they put it in Tom's guitars. And they've started selling that pickup. Like, I mean, I bought one at Guitar Center like years and years ago. And I think it was really because they knew it was going to sell like how Invaders did for people who wanted to put that in their guitars because of Tom. So it looks like it has either one of the earlier remakes of Dirty Fingers or just an old one someone had and they put it in there. maybe it came with an Invader and they swapped it out because he wanted to have the consistency of the new pickup. But it's weird, like, did he order that Jazzmaster and then it didn't come until after he got into the Gibsons? Did Fender say, hey, we're going to make you this, and then it didn't show up on time? I'm assuming, again, I don't have the info in front of me, maybe it exists, but I'm assuming Fender was thinking, you know, Blink and 04 is still very, very popular, probably the biggest they were at any point at that time. Probably thinking, we sold a ton of these Strats, the Squires and the Fenders, make a Jazzmaster, people are going to double dip then and buy, you know, another Tom DeLonge guitar. It's a fun shape. They weren't doing a ton of offset stuff besides signature models or higher end models at that time. And I don't know, I'm thinking that probably would have been his next signature had he been into that. So it's just an interesting thing to think about, like how the Gibsons show up first and then the new Fender comes, and he used it, but it was just like because he needed a baritone. I don't know, I just thought that was an interesting point. Okay, so we go to amps, and this is really where the main talking points are. So the Japanese magazine that a Redditor put up, I forget their name, but thank you for that. It was really cool of you to share that. Gave us a lot more info about Tom's rig. However, I will say most of like the actual amps and stuff, we kind of knew that he had in the back. He didn't show like his rack gear or his head on stage at this time, just the cabs, but they definitely like had that information available, especially because companies like Mesa, you know, Tom is so popular, and I'm sure anybody who could afford like a Mesa amp that wanted it because of Tom was going to buy it. Obviously they're pretty expensive and a lot of kids can't, you know, fork that up, but many of us later down the line ended up getting one. Now, his triple rectifier was still in the mix here. So Tom's triple rectifier he had an earlier one. I believe the first thing he had was a dual rectifier rack mount. This is like 97, 98. By 90, or maybe 96, 97, he goes to the triple rectifier, the silver diamond plated one with the blue and the pink alien heads on it. You can see that in like the Josie video. I believe he sold that one when he sold a bunch of gear. And then around Enema, he starts getting into these custom Mesas because they had options that you could order, like different, you know, like versions, different looks. Just, it was all aesthetics, but you can order custom what you want. So he ended up getting, and he talked about it in some article, like this really cool design, the brown one with like the tan front. So that's a late 90s, I'm assuming a 99 Mesa triple rectifier. It's a 3-channel amp. It has like the clean, crunch, and the lead, but it's only 2 EQs. So that's kind of what separates it from all the stuff that came out in like 2000 or early 2000s through now, is they all have 3 channels of EQ. So I played a dual rectifier for quite a while. I used it live quite a bit, and mine was, I don't remember what year, maybe in 09, but it was like 3 separate EQs, one for each channel, and then they all had the different modes, whereas before they didn't have as much going on. And you can kind of see on Tom's settings, they're marked like with like a silver pen or something like that, like a Sharpie. It looks like his main kind of setting is the gain is not even halfway, maybe around like 4, you know? The bass is slightly halfway, treble about halfway, but the mids are totally dimed out. And obviously things like volume, you know, that's going to kind of change from time to time, but it doesn't look like it was even halfway for the dirty channel. Now I don't know how much of the clean he was actually using on that. I think it was mainly just the dirty, like the modern dirty sound, and he's blending it with other stuff. So when you dime stuff out or drop stuff back, it is gonna kind of also affect differently, like how it sounds with other amps. But yeah, those mids are dimed out on that thing. At least that's what the marker says. Now he's running that into a 212 Mesa cab with a 412 Mesa cab, and that's what each amp is going into. But they're mic'd a little differently, so I'm going to talk about that after I get through the other amps. The Mesa tri-axis preamp was a pretty popular preamp back in the day, but it's kind of funny that somebody like Tom using it, not because it doesn't sound great. I think they're awesome. Like, I actually wouldn't mind having one. The unit was a preamp unit that would reflect a Mesa Mark series, like a Mark 1, a Mark 2C+, I believe the Mark 3 and the Mark 4, which at that time probably was the newest one that was even out. But Mark series are a lot different than like a rectifier.
You fucking Mark!
Not so much that they're not like high gain or you can't use them for nice cleans, but they have like kind of a different sort of feel and vibe to them. They're really great. I mean, you can use them for all kind of different music. Mark 1, they kind of have more of like a vintagey thing, and they can get a little bit more aggressive with some more bite. The Mark 2C Plus has famously been used on a bunch of Metallica stuff. They slaved them out for Master of Puppets with their power sections from their Marshalls, and they've gone on record saying they've used those for every album since, which is pretty impressive. The Mark III I don't know as much about. They don't seem to be as popular because the Mark II C+, I guess, just lived up to some sort of legacy. But then Mark IVs came out, people were buying them. I remember they're very expensive, but they're great amps. Something to note is that when Tom got into playing Mesas, one of the bands that they were touring with was Pennywise. He was playing the Ampeg heads that were kind of like a hotter version of like a Marshall 900 before that. Fletcher Drake from Pennywise, he's known for kind of being into that Mesa sound a la, Metallica of that era, or prior to that era. Even though they're a punk band, it's kind of much more aggressive than some of the other stuff that was going on tone-wise back in the late 80s and early 90s. So Tom actually has noted that he got into Mesas because of like Fletcher and wanting to sound like Pennywise. They were touring with them, and that's a big reason they ended up getting on Warped Tour and et cetera, et cetera. That's a different story for a different time, which you could probably find online. But Tom had actually bought a Mark IV because of Pennywise, at least that's what he said. So he had a Mark IV. It would make sense to me that maybe he wanted to use the Triaxis to get into that ballpark versus some of the other ones. But that's just a guess based on things we've heard, read, and seen online. There's even a reverb seller selling one of Tom's Mark IVs. He had a little note. Again, those, who knows if that's true or not, but he did have a Mark IV, so that's probably where he was trying to get in the ballpark with that particular preamp. And then John Petrucci from Dream Theater was using the Mark II-C Plus as well, and they made him a signature version of that. And I believe him and the guys from Metallica and everybody who were using these Mark series on tours ended up getting this Triaxis preamp in their rack, so then they don't have to bring these heads, especially older heads, out on tour. And then Tom was using a Mesa Power amp to power it. So you're essentially getting a Mesa head, but you have a bunch of different options. There's different, ways you can use it. You can use these, obviously, the different preamps from each amp. You can use like a very pristine and clean sound. You can get really thrashy and aggressive. Some have more mids and low ends. Some have a bit more of a high end bite. But these are amps that were used a lot in metal, and they're great for rock, pop punk. Like, to me, tone is not really like a genre thing exactly, but we kind of group it into that because bands do similar things in similar genres, and then we talk about it like it applies specifically to that. I'm thinking he's using this to blend for different things, but really it's interesting to me that he went after this. It's like he really clearly liked the Mesa Distortion, but this is a different version of it. So instead of having two rectifiers and setting them up different, he gets all kind of different things here. The third amp is very similar as well. It's a Marshall JMP1 preamp, and with a Marshall, they're like EL34 power section, power amp. So it's the same idea, but Marshall. These are two pretty legendary preamps, and the Marshall one is loaded with kind of the same thing as the Mesa, but for Marshall. So, 800 tones, clean tones, plexi tones. And a lot of people use this one back in the 90s. Billy Corgan, I believe, was using it for Melancholy, which has tons of tones on it. Steph Carpenter from Deftones, he went on record saying that he liked it because he was only limited to 2 or 3 tones with like a head, but with this he has, 90 or whatever he can use. And obviously guys aren't really using 90 tones live, but you can get in the ballpark of different albums if you have different releases, or you can blend stuff, or just get different things for different sections of songs, and get a custom MIDI controller, which we're going to talk about for Tom in a minute here. So this kind of does the Marshall thing. So instead of him bringing a 900 out on tour like he used to, he can get that kind of sound. Probably 800s, I would say, probably were more. If he's using it for the clean, I'm sure that was the stock clean in that. I don't remember. But again, it's the same kind of idea as the Mesa. Lots of variety there. And with a big foot switch, you can set up your MIDI and flip things on and off with the flip of a button. So before I get into the foot switch and the effects in his rack, I want to go out and say this. Many people have voiced their opinion that they wish Tom would go back to playing his mesas, be it like Enema or Jacket era or like this era that we're talking about, 0304. If you look at what Tom started doing after working with Jerry Finn with blending amps and having different amps and whirlwind boxes, and then later this kind of setup with two preamps with their own power amps and a head and a GCX switcher, and he's able to kind of use MIDI with his foot switch to hit his clean, his dirty, this different stuff, which I'm going to talk about that in a minute. If you look at people like Billy Corgan, like Steph Carpenter, who are using these units, and then you look at what they're doing now, it's very similar to Tom. Billy Corgan, who has the money and the access to do this, got a guy to fly over from Europe and build preamps of like 8 or maybe a dozen of his amps he had in his studio and a duplicate set, and he has a rack with all these preamps, and he's also using Helix for effects now. And like Jeff Schroeder, who just recently left Pumpkins, he was using straight up Helix, and there's a huge band and they're using all this stuff instead of real amps. Same thing with like Deftones. Steph's been on like Axe effects for at least 10 years, if not longer. I think before that he was even using like a laptop and had like guitar rig with it. So there's a lot of variation here between what you can use, but the main idea here is guys were trying to do stuff that nowadays you can do with like an Axe effects, a Helix, Neural DSP, whatever gear you want to use, but you don't have to bring out a bunch of units. Like you can go and fly with it in your backpack. If you're in a smaller band and you have a power amp, like a Duncan Power Stage, and like for me, I have a Duncan Power Stage and a Helix LT, and I can go somewhere where there's a cab for me or go direct if I need to, and I can play. Now, I'm not saying that's the best or the worst or my favorite thing to do, but the idea here is these guys are blending, in Tom's case, he always said the dirty of the Mesa, the clean of the Marshall, and then, obviously this other Mesa unit does pretty much both really well, and he's able to use his MIDI controller and get different hybrids of tones. So I think when you look at people saying, well, I wish you'd go back to that, he's kind of doing that. It's just in Axe effects. Now, the record might not reflect those Mesa tones, and that's a different conversation. But like live, no matter if he's using Plexis or Soldanos or whatever kind of models he's using, all these guys who are doing this stuff, they have access to do it now in units where they don't have to bring 40 billion pieces of gear. So I really think that this is kind of all a precursor to what he's doing now. Now, with that being said, I know he tried to do the thing with the Vox and the Fenders and whatever, but again, to Tom, it seems like they're just tools, and he wants the best thing for his work. If you get into the MIDI switching, his board was this GCX switcher that it was labeled. It looked like the bank, like there's about a dozen buttons, but there's 2 that are to up and down like different banks of settings. I don't think he really used that many, so one of them was taped off. Across the bottom, he had a dirty, a clean, one that said candy, and then one that said testicles, I think. And then I couldn't really make out what was up on top. But in his effects unit, he had the G-Force like rack mount effects that a lot of people used to use, and then a Boss BF3 flanger. And I'm thinking that G-Force is more chorus, and then the flange is kind of more of a dry manual flange. I have that Boss flanger. It's amazing. I think it's a great flanger. It's right up there for me with like the MXR, like the Van Halen, or the gray one, or the one that they painted later. It's the same, pretty much the same pedal. I like that kind of idea of tape flange, airplane taking off, or it's dry. And if you're doing like a chug on like a distorted tone, you're gonna get that dun 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 dun, like that kind of effect. Tom kind of lived in both worlds from what I could hear. If you watch like them playing A Letter to Elise on the Cure MTV Icon show, it's very like a wet flange, and you can get flangers that do that, especially like an Electric Mistress or something like that. But it almost seemed like he was running a chorus and a flange in unison. So I'm wondering if he wasn't, if you look at the dirty, the clean, and then the other 2, I'm wondering if it wasn't like his main dirty tone, his main clean tone, Candy is his effects together, flange and chorus. I'm wondering if the one that said testicles wasn't like not just a joke, but more of a ballsy setting for like bigger parts, or maybe it's like, you know, the effects and the distortion. Because again, with this MIDI switching, you can do different things. You can use the clean from the Mesa and the Marshall, then switch one of them or switch both and whatever with the flick of a button, depending on how you have it set up. Now, what's really interesting here is the amp and cab situation, how it's mic'd. So it looks like they're all like Neumann, like U87s or whatever, the condenser mics, which are, I don't know, like probably $3,500 each, are pretty crazy expensive. If you're looking at the cabs on the stage, the left side, the 412 is mic'd. In the middle, the 212 is mic'd on each side, and then on the right, the other 412 is mic'd. This was interesting because it makes me think this whatever was running through the center cab was trying to be done in stereo or had that option. This can kind of go either way because depending on the sound system, the sound guy, the venue, what the guitar player is trying to accomplish with different amps, your in-ears, your monitors, any of that stuff, it can affect that. It can be kind of redundant or unnecessary if done wrong, or it can be really cool. I'm trying to figure out if Tom didn't maybe have clean tones in stereo, so when he turns the lead off and it's just a dry clean, they're not coming out of both the left and the right. And then when it's on the dirty channel, you're getting the clean in each blended with the two different Mesa signals. So for example, like if you're on your distortion channel and you have your right and your left, or your left and your right, one of them is the dual or the triple rectifier on the dirty channel and a clean Marshall. And then the other side is a tri-axis on like a Mark, we'll say a Mark 2C plus and a clean Marshall. And they're making two different sounds and it's giving it a totally different texture. And then when you go to clean and you hit that button, it's the two distortions come off, so you still have the clean going stereo. That's my assumption. Now, I could be totally wrong because this can be done in a bunch of different ways and doesn't really have to be one way or the other. But just from reading and listening to how Tom liked to blend things, I'm just thinking maybe he didn't want to stack the two distortions necessarily in mono. And so in stereo together. So they're going mono left, mono right. Now, again, when you're recording, it's pretty, well known, like most times when you're playing this kind of music, at least, you're going to do a rhythm track hard left, rhythm track hard right, if not multiple. The reason for that is to make it kind of have more of a wide sound. You're never going to play identical, even if you're really good. Like even James Hetfield, who's probably the tightest rhythm player ever, or at least one of them, there's very small little differences, and it makes it have kind of a wider sound because they're not lined up 1,000%. Now to the human ear, it's hard to tell, but in the grand scheme of things, it makes it wider. Live, you can't really do that if you're one guitar player playing it all at the same time. I mean, you can try to set like one side to a slight delay, but again, it's hard to do that. Even personally for me, when one of my bands didn't have a second guitar player, I was putting a cab on each side of the stage, like a Mesa cab on the left and the right, but I would really only run one amp. I mean, I could use two amps if I wanted to do two different tones or to blend them, because I had a whirlwind box and a couple of different heads, but I just kind of found it to be like, we would play smaller clubs, and sometimes depending on the size of the club and the sound guy, people up front weren't getting the guitar on the one end, which is a really important part of that. But it was never the same effect as like recording. So that's just kind of my theory on like what was going on there. Again, I could be 1,000% wrong. Like if somebody knows better than me, please let me know. I want to ask one of my buddies who's a sound guy, who's like a touring sound guy, about this, but today stuff is so different too. Like again, if you're running a Helix or a neural quad cortex or Axe Effects or even a Kemper or whatever, everybody's making this now, Boss, Fender, they all have a unit. You can set it up so many different ways. It's insane. But back in the day, this was kind of a precursor to what all these units were. So that's just kind of my idea of what's going on there, is that the clean stays on the whole time. Or maybe for the testicle setting, The Marshall is the one that gets switched, so it's Marshall clean on each side, 2 different mesas, and then the Marshall goes from a cleaner sound to a little bit of a like more broken up, a bigger sound, and that's kind of like a big, either for your chorus or like maybe like a big outro to something, maybe when they're playing Easy Target or I don't know, something like that. Again, just a guess, just an idea, educated guess. I'm not saying I know for sure. A couple other things to note. Tom started carrying a lot of this stuff into Angels and Airwaves, but he had 2 guitar players, so it feels to me like his experience there changed what he wanted to do when he went back to Blink, getting friends at Fender and Vox or whatever the case was. But now it's like the Axe Effects pretty much does whatever he needs it to. So it's like I saw his rack when I was at one of the last shows I went to, and it's like a little floor rack, and it has, you know, just his Axe Effects and whatever else in there. And that's what he had with a bunch of guitars and a little box with a bunny on it with drinks in it. Like, that's it. Like, wireless is in there, Furman power conditioner, power amps, whatever it is. But like, it's all in this one little, like, I shouldn't say little, they are heavy, but this little, wheeled rack unit. And instead, before, he has one that's the size of a small refrigerator with an amp head and 3 212s and 3 412s, and before that 2 amps and all. It's like, it's a lot of gear. So this saves you on costs when traveling, especially overseas and flying them. And it seems to me that, like, if it's a good enough sound for them to play to and they still like it, for people who are that nerdy about gear, you can still do this stuff with modern gear, and it actually makes it easier. Now, again, I use real amps as well, recording and live. I'm into both. So am I going to say that, like, playing through, my Helix with a power amp, or even using my head through a cab, is exactly the same as using my amp? No, but that's a tonal difference thing. It's not, sometimes it's a feel thing, but again, it also depends on how you dial it in, because I've heard people, and I'm not joking, I've heard live bands using like Line 6 pod, whatever, not the Helix unit, but the one below it, where it's like a pod unit, pod 5 or whatever, the pedal board going into a soundboard. I've heard that sound better than people who had dual rectifiers, because they didn't know how to dial them in for the room. Like, again, the physics of sound is so complicated, and that people don't realize, like, on my end, the room I'm sitting in where I do a lot of recording, it's small, and if I don't use real amps in here often. I used to, but it would bounce right off the wall and give me a totally different sound than my band's practice spaces. One of our practice spaces is a studio live room, and it's more of a square shape. The other band practice space that we used for a long time was more of like a rectangle, totally different sounding. Every venue, different sounding. The biggest venues that we would normally play would be 700-ish, maybe 1,000, more like in the 700 ballpark. And I'm not saying we were selling those out, we were opening shows or whatever, but a bigger room, especially with the dual rectifier, it's not slapping me in the face right away, it's kind of going out. And I could tell the difference if there's a lot of people at the show versus like a more empty room with some people. Sound checks especially, you could tell the difference, the monitor. And then we would play like small hardcore shows, and literally like my Mesa on the same settings would sound razor sharp compared to like a more beefy sound, because it's coming right back at me. It has to do with a lot of different factors. Sound is weird. So I think if you're going for this kind of sound, it's good to experiment with different things, but it really depends on like what you're doing. Like if you're jamming in your room to a Blink record, yeah, like I like telling people like, hey, here's how I dialed this in. Here's maybe a good starting point for you, and then you can kind of change it up, because your amp's different, your monitors are different, your ears are different than mine. Nobody's right or perfect 100% of the time. With that being said, I'm going to give it a shot to dial some of these tones in, and I think I'm going to use the Camden 04 show for my bass point, and then try to find a couple other good examples, because it's really hard to get like a great quality feed of that live tone that Tom was using. Anyways, I appreciate the request. Happy New Year. Mondays are looking like they're going to be tone talks and also accompanying videos as soon as possible, either the same day or the next day. Wednesdays are looking like lesson days, tutorials. Fridays are kind of my miscellaneous days, so we'll probably have some vlogs and different things like that. I have some stuff lined up already, so we're going to get the Sum 41 All Killer No Filler video. There's going to be a Boxcar Racer video. There's going to be like a grunge, like modern grunge tone video, and then again with the lessons, a lot of Blink stuff coming up, a lot of Super Heaven stuff I have to finish, etc. And I set up the Twitch and the Patreon so we can kind of get into some live tone building and some communicating, and you guys can kind of vote on or let me know what you want. But I'm really excited for 2024. Thanks everybody who's been subscribing to the channel. I really appreciate you guys, and for all the new people, welcome. I appreciate having you here, and I'm looking forward to a fun year on the channel and learning and communicating and doing a lot of cool stuff. So have a great New Year's Day, have a great 2024, and I will see you all later. Have fun playing guitar. Peace.